So the first thing to say, I guess everybody heard that message, is that we're going to record the lecture this evening, but we are not going to record the discussion afterwards. So just to make you aware of that. So first of all, good evening, everyone. You're all very welcome to the Oral History Network of Ireland's annual lecture for 2021. My name is Regina Fitzpatrick, and along with Dr. Arlene Crampsey, I'm the co-chair of the Oral History Network of Ireland, and I will be the chair for this evening's lecture. So traditionally, this event has been held in the beautiful surroundings of the National Library of Ireland, but we decided to keep us all safe and healthy for the second year running to move it online. But it's so lovely to see so many of you in attendance tonight. You're all very, very welcome, old friends and new. And traditionally, we'd go across the road for a Christmas drink after this. So I hope you have a nice Christmas drink to hand tonight. So before I introduce our special guest this evening, I would like to thank all of my colleagues on the Oral History Network of Ireland committee and board for their organisation, not just of this event, but for all of their hard work in organising events and sessions and the work of the network over the past year. It's taken a lot of voluntary effort, a lot of time and creativity and energy, and I'm very grateful for that. We've had a great year despite the circumstances. We've managed to run a full program of events over the last year virtually, along with our annual conference. And we would like to thank all of our members for your continued support and everybody who has attended our events. And just to remind you that memberships are available on our website, Oral History Network of Ireland. They make a lovely Christmas present, and you can find out more there. And also keep an eye on the website for our calendar of events for 2022. So I guess the Oral History Network's annual lecture has always been an event to engage with and to celebrate excellence in oral history related to Ireland. And this year is no exception, as we are delighted to welcome Dr. Anna Bryson. So Anna is a senior lecturer in the School of Law and a fellow at the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice. Her research has developed along three closely related lines: modern Irish history, sociolinguistic studies, and transitional justice. Since completing her PhD at Trinity College Dublin in 2003, Anna has been involved in a series of research projects exploring various aspects of the legacy and history of conflict. Her publications include 4 books and more than 20 articles or book chapters. Anna has a particular interest in oral history and has to date conducted more than 200 substantial interviews with a wide range of individuals, including ex-combatants and former prisoners, victims and survivors, former security force personnel, lawyers, politicians, and senior government officials. She's the Northern Ireland regional contact point for the Oral History Society and provides accredited training on their behalf. In 2020, Anna was elected as chair of the independent human rights organisation, the Committee on the Administration of Justice. To add to Anna's accolades, she was a founding director of the Oral History Network of Ireland, and her expertise was absolutely crucial in the development of ONI in the early years, which is why it gives me particular pleasure to welcome Anna here this evening. This evening's lecture will be followed by time for discussion and questions and answers chaired by both myself and Arlene. And I suppose without further ado, I would like to hand over now to Anna and welcome her here this evening.
Thank you, Regina. I hope you can hear me okay, can you? Yeah. Okay, well, I trust you. I see a thumbs up. Thank you so much for that lovely warm welcome, Regina. And for so many reasons, I wish that I could be given this lecture in person, not least so that I could walk across the road with you all afterwards and celebrate a Christmas drink. Because I have such fond memories actually of our early meetings and trying to put the network together and traveling the lengths and breadths of Ireland, trying to garner up enthusiasm for the practice of oral history. And it was a total pleasure to work with colleagues that I'm so delighted to see here again this evening. So thank you so much for the honour of asking me to give the lecture this evening. I feel I should start with an apology for a less than festive theme for my annual lecture. I will be focusing on the somewhat dark kind of topic of oral history in the shadow of conflict, truth, justice and accounting for the past. And as you can see on those images on that cover slide, there are obvious kind of challenges and dangers that working in a post-conflict context throws down. But there's also a tremendous appetite and indeed a need, I would say, for oral history work. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work that I've been involved in this area this evening. So just to give you a kind of a very brief overview of what I'm hoping to cover, I'll say a little bit just about a background to my work in the area, just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from. Not least because I have kind of worked in oral history in different disciplines, and that's part of the kind of journey that I want to sort of share with you this evening. I will focus, however, quite specifically on the role of oral history in evolving government proposals here since 1998 to deal with the legacy of conflict. I look in particular at the role of oral history and its place in the 2014 Stormont House Agreement. And as part of that, I want to think about some of the particular opportunities and challenges that arise. Bringing us then a little bit more up to date, I'll reflect on I suppose, concerns that I have around the dangers of oral history being co-opted as part of the recent government about turn from the Stormont House Agreement towards proposals that would introduce quite a sweeping amnesty. And to conclude then, I'll try and tease out that relationship between oral history, truth, justice, and dealing with the past. So just to give you a little bit of a background, Regina has obviously very kindly kind of introduced some of the work that I've been involved in. But as many of you will know, I started out my sort of journey in oral history doing a PhD with David Fitzpatrick at Trinity. And I focused on the period 1945 to 69. So I was very taken with the idea of oral history from below, using oral history to reach out to voices and narratives that weren't featuring in the documentary archives. And really it was a detailed local history of my hometown in that period, 1945 to 69. And I'll come back to that in a couple of slides time because I've kind of, it's a project that I'm recently just returned to. But when I finished the PhD, I suppose my interest in oral history then unfolded for a long, I think 7 years in total. I worked on 2 successive volumes that Sean McConville was putting together on Irish political prisoners. I think we did 160 interviews in total for that project. And that included, the eldest was 104 and spoke to his experience of imprisonment in the 1920s. He kept calling Portlaoise Maryborough. I mean, so it really did stretch back that far, but it came right up through the decades to include those released under the Good Friday Agreement. And it wasn't just Loyalist, Republican and other prisoners of various different hues and affiliations. We also spoke to prison staff, to prison chaplains, to tutors and others right across the jurisdictions. I've also used oral history, I suppose, in a more maybe conventional way in working on a biography of Thecla Beer, where I really was primarily doing archival work, but supplementing it with interviews with civil servants. And I should actually say that maybe interestingly, falling out of the prison work on oral history, I had an opportunity to do a little bit of, I think Alistair Thompson is on the call, and I wouldn't like to suggest that what I was doing was anything as sophisticated and impressive as what he has done in revisiting his Anzac memories in light of new veterans' files. But I did, with one of my interviewees, he presented me with a prison diary at the end of the interview that he found in the attic. It was actually a series of 6 diaries that he had kept in secret while he was in prison. And one of the really interesting parts of me working those diaries up into an edited book was, together with Eamon, revisiting the original oral history interview I had done with him in light of that, of those diaries. And that was a really interesting process for me. Other than that, I suppose I went on to work on a peace-funded project, the Peace Process Layers of Meaning. And again, I see Anne-Marie and others on the call, which is lovely to see people who were involved in that project way back then. we put together an oral history archive of 100 interviews, deliberately diverse voices associated with the peace process. So our advisory committee for that project, I think after we had about 30 interviews done, just said, like yawned basically and said, this is pale, male and stale. Could you get more inventive? Some of these voices we've already heard from, and they encouraged us to go out to talk to people in business, talk to teachers, talk to people who swept the streets after bombs, and to juxtapose that with the Bertie Aherns of this world. So you had voices from above and below and everywhere in between. We did an oral history training program. As part of that, produced a film, and Dara Gannon and others worked with me on an online directory of extant oral history interviews that were accessible via online media. And we ran 3 cross-community local projects as well. But since 2014, I moved with my family basically then to Belfast and took a job in the QUB School of Law, where they were interested in my oral history skills, but to apply them to a project, a social legal project on lawyers in conflict and transition. Now, that was a nice opportunity for me to kind of broaden my gaze well beyond Northern Ireland and to engage in research that extended to Chile, to South Africa, to Tunisia, to Israel, to Palestine, and Cambodia. And that was really, really interesting for me, because I was now kind of using interviews in a slightly different way. And again, with the Brexit and the Peace Process project that was funded by the ESRC, I was again working with social legal scholars and doing interviews in a slightly different way. But more recently, I've kind of, I suppose, found ways for oral history proper, as it were, to kind of be applied to the most recent project I've worked on, is using oral history to look at the law centres movement. So again, it's very much a kind of an oral history from below. I've worked as well, as Regina mentioned, with ONI and more recently with the Oral History Society, but also with the Stories Network here, which is run by Healing Through Remembering, and indeed with Sean O'Connell, my colleague here in the Queen's University Oral History Technology and Ethics Quote Forum. So there's different kind of ways in which I suppose I've moved between history, social sciences and law, and maybe some of that will come through in what I share with you this evening. But basically what I want to focus on, as I said, is work that I've been doing around using oral history as part of a process to try and deal with the past. So before I get into that, I thought it might be helpful to just very briefly say a word or two about what we mean by transitional justice, because I suppose I'm so accustomed now to working in this field that I kind of, it's very easy to assume that people who don't work in this area would necessarily know straight off what we mean. And I suppose, put simply, I've quoted the UN Secretary General in 2004 as saying it comprises the full range of processes and mechanisms associated with a society's attempt to come to terms with a legacy of large-scale past abuses, and that can range in scale, but it's in order to ensure accountability, serve justice and achieve reconciliation. And it might include judicial, non-judicial mechanisms, differing levels of international involvement or none, and indeed individual prosecutions, reparations, truth-seeking, institutional reform, vetting, dismissals, or a combination thereof. And I've listed below just the types of themes that come through. We've just finished a 4-year project on apologies and acknowledgement. So there's different themes that myself and colleagues have been working on in and around transitional justice. But turning then to the situation here and dealing with the past proposals that have been in the ether here, really, I suppose, since the Good Friday Agreement. As many of you will know, the 1998 Good Friday or Belfast Agreement, it wasn't possible at that point to reach agreement on a holistic set of measures to deal with the past. So there was no reference to formal truth recovery or indeed any complementary oral history work at that stage. It was kicked into touch, if you like. And instead, what emerged in its place in the absence of an overarching mechanism was what's often referred to as a piecemeal approach to dealing with the past. So we see a package of measures unfolding that includes public inquiries, inquests, and there's 50 or more still in the pipeline, the Disappeared Commission, the 300 and more cases dealt with by the Office of the Police Ombudsman, the HET, Cold Case Review, and indeed alongside those legalistic mechanisms for accessing truth and justice, we have seen community from below work, and indeed academic oral history work, some of it funded by Peace 3, some of it sponsored and supported by the Commission for Victims and Survivors, NI, the statutory agency that works with victims and survivors groups. And indeed, I've often been interested and hugely impressed by the way in which that type of work has been adapted in the creative arts through, for example, theatres of witness and so forth. But there was a recognition, in spite of the good work that has been done and continues to be done, that we need to find a more comprehensive and coordinated way of dealing with the vexed issue of the past. And so in 1998, after the agreement, you had Bloomfield saying in his report, he's talking about a truth commission, but saying that it could only occur in the context of far-reaching political accommodation, acknowledging that at that point in time, it felt just like something that was out of reach. But between 1998 and 2006, you have hard and long years of consultation and work that goes into evaluating each and every possible way of looking at a truth recovery process. That involves extensive work with victims, with the PSNI, with the ex-army, with loyalists, with Republican civil society actors. And it culminates in a report in 2006 by Kieran McAvoy that ran to 123 pages, and it's called Making Peace with the Past, Options for Truth Recovery. And that was described as by the consultative group in the past, I think, as their Bible. So that kind of work that went into evaluating those different options fed through then into the report, and indeed informed the work that Eames and Bradley, Lord Eames and Dennis Bradley did as part of their work in the consultative group on the past. And as you know, they called for an independent legacy commission to lead work, including work on storytelling. And part of what I'm doing here is showing that oral history and what's sometimes referred to as storytelling has been a constant thread. It featured again in the agreement brokered by Richard Haas and Megan O'Sullivan. They called for a central archive for sharing conflict-related oral histories. And again, it featured in the Stormont House Agreement, where an oral history archive was one of 4 key mechanisms that was proposed. But I suppose part of what I wanted to say here is that we've been talking about a truth recovery process for the best part of 20 years. And so I suppose maybe sometimes I get a little bit impatient when I see, just last week I was speaking at an event and maybe someone put in a chat, we really need to talk about a South African TRC for Northern Ireland. We've been talking about this for 20 years. And part of what happened here was initially Republicans were very keen on a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, although I think in response to pressure from victims, including victims within their own community, it's clear that they have shifted position. But more clearly from the get-go, you had very, very strong unionist opposition to a TRC. And that all helps to explain why the Stormont House Agreement was fashioned as it was, to reflect the political realities here and to reflect 20 years of debate and hard negotiation on these issues. So it was imperfect, it was clunky in ways, but it reflects that which the British and Irish government and the 5 main political parties here could agree on, the best degree of consensus we could reach at that point. And I think that that kind of that state of affairs was reflected in a public survey we commissioned as part of our work on the Apologies, Abuses and Dealing with the Past project. It was we used a market survey company to survey 1,000 people in Ireland, north and south, so a stratified sample of the population. And just to say that here in the north, there was 502 people responded. It was gratifying for us that people thought apologies mattered, but also gratifying for me that storytelling, which is often, as I say, sometimes shorthand for oral history work, was seen as very important. Interesting too, though, as I've just been saying, there isn't a huge appetite, far from it, for an amnesty, because prosecutions actually came in ahead of storytelling and indeed apologies. So I mentioned the Stormont House Agreement. And basically, again, just to sort of recap for those of you that don't live and breathe this stuff, as I sometimes feel I do, it proposed 4 mechanisms. So the Historical Investigations Unit was an independent body. It was envisaged as an independent body to take forward investigations into outstanding troubles-related deaths. So it would have had police and disclosure powers, And the main product would be a family report. So there's often a lot of talk about the need to end prosecutions. The focus here really isn't on prosecutions. It's on the information, the family report that would come to families as a result of a thorough and an effective investigation. Alongside that, there was an independent commission on information retrieval to enable victims and survivors to seek and privately receive information about the deaths of their next of kin. So that's focusing more specifically on information, more primarily on information recovery. It's a voluntary process, and those statements would be protected. So there's limited immunity for statements that are given to that body. There was then the Oral History Archive, which is the mechanism, obviously, that I had a particular interest in and worked on. And that was to provide a central place to share experiences and narratives relating to the Troubles. And then to try and draw it all together, there was provision for an implementation and reconciliation group to oversee patterns and themes emerging from all three of the different mechanisms. And that was, I suppose, geared towards looking at the big picture and moving us towards, I suppose, a reconciliation focus. Now, I mentioned that I moved to Queen's in 2014 and started working here in the law school. I also in 2014 was invited to join a team that had been set up at that point. It later became dubbed the Model Bill team because we set about developing model legislation for the implementation of those mechanisms that had been agreed at Stormont House. But essentially, it was a team of human rights lawyers, myself, working here in Queen's, working together with our colleagues in the Committee on the Administration of Justice, a local human rights NGO. And we sort of basically set ourselves the mission of providing free legal and technical advice to political parties, to the two governments, to civil society, and so forth. And I suppose since we've got on the road, we've produced more than 30 reports, and our focus has been always on trying to call attention to what the clauses would look like in human rights compliant legislation. And at different points following the launch of the Model Bill at the House of Lords, following my colleagues giving evidence to US Congress, I have spoken to the Oireachtas Committee on the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement. We've worked with the Defence Committee recently, the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee. We've basically had dozens of bilateral meetings, as I say, 6 conferences, more than 20 seminars at this stage, and dozens of meetings, including with victims, army and other stakeholders, to, in the first instance, I suppose, dabble with the detail of what the Stormont House Agreement might look like in legislation, and then to address various stumbling blocks that have arisen thereafter. So in April 2020, I suppose to try and take stock and look at why things had been delayed for so long, we thought that it might be helpful to do a root and branch review of all of the different solutions that have been put in the public domain, and to benchmark them against 3 things: the Good Friday Agreement, the Stormont House Agreement, and human rights standards. And then more recently, as I'll come back to, we have launched a report there in September, our response to the NIO's recent proposals. But before we kind of get into these recent proposals, I want to kind of take a step back and just together with you reflect on what the key kind of value added is of oral history in this landscape. And I suppose certainly in those early days when I was sitting down with human rights lawyers to argue the case for oral history, and why, I mean, I used to sometimes insist that we brought it up to the top of the agenda, because there is always a danger that it'll drop back because we are, I suppose, understandably focused on the thorny issues that arise around the HIU and the ICIR. And I was always, I suppose, born of my own experience of working in the field and my passion for the contribution that it can make, calling attention to its capacity to, first of all, the obvious point, engage a broader range of individuals, a broader range of people than will kind of come before the courts necessarily or have cause or need to have their stories told through legalistic mechanisms. So you can reach out to a much broader range of individuals and acknowledge that there are victims and survivors right across society. I think it's impossible to downplay the importance of giving voice to people. And I remember talking to Maurice Hayes, even when he was working on Tala Hospital, saying just the importance of people having that opportunity to be heard. And certainly I know over the years, I have never ceased to be humbled by just how much people do value that opportunity to tell their story in their own words in full, and to know that that transcript and recording will be preserved for their family and hopefully if deposited in an archive for future generations. You know, I'd be amazed sometimes if somebody told me that they read from a transcript of the deceased at his funeral, and somebody else told me that, you know, their father kept a transcript beside the bed and was beside his bed on the wee table when he died with just a little prayer book. And it's things like that that just remind me that people do really value that opportunity, as I say, to be heard. I have an interest, I suppose, in gender dynamics, and I've always felt that it's you know, this is an area in which we have so much work to do in terms of documenting the conflict, and oral history is certainly one of the ways in which we can reach out to and engage with some of those gender dynamics with women's voices, but also indeed with looking at different forms of masculinity and so on that come out of the way that oral history can enable us to reach out to voices and perspectives that don't typically make it in, as I say, to the documentary archives. I come from a rural background, so not surprisingly, I suppose I would emphasize the very different experience of conflict in a housing estate in Portadown or in Strabane or in Shantallow versus dark country lanes and growing up in the countryside, and the very different challenges that arise and different experiences of peacemaking too. Paddy Keatley talked about intergenerational trauma in that recent video that received so much attention. And I absolutely agree that intergenerational trauma is a huge issue that we're only beginning to just scratch the surface of. And again, I think oral history can do some very important work in that area. And then I suppose having shored up existing oral history accounts and gathered more, there's no end to the ways in which oral history material can be adapted to facilitate a really diverse range of initiatives. So museum exhibitions, dramas, education programs, the work that has been done by Relatives for Justice and others working with quilts, adapting them for various different types of online resources, public memorials, and indeed feeding through into complementary work on days of remembrance and so forth. And as I've often talked about in the past, all of this can undoubtedly help to soften lines, to build trust and to generate the type of political generosity that we're so often lacking. And that in turn can be a catalyst, if you like, for broader reconciliation. I said I would come back to sort of why I've become more interested in the work I did on the pre-Troubles period. And I suppose it's in thinking about this last issue that I flagged around taking a longer and a broader view. Because, I mean, I really do, I'm becoming more and more convinced that this is one of the things that oral history brings to the table. I suppose the more legalistic mechanisms do tend to be sometimes more kind of present-centered. And oral history can certainly draw out and draw us into the very deep and tangled and complex roots of our conflict. And that would include for me a need to look at the pre-conflict conflict, if you like, the years building up to 1969. Because I mean, this is what we do as historians. We unsettle, you know, kind of binaries and hegemonic kind of breaks and wrestle with the kind of the messiness of the past. And I think that taking that longer and broader view is something that is another area where oral history can really make a valuable contribution to the broader kind of work of transitional justice. But as you all know, and as I alluded to on the cover slide, this is not a bed of roses. There's nothing easy about this. There are obvious challenges associated with post-conflict oral history work. And so, for example, as we all know, I'm not going to talk in any detail about the Boston College project, but it underlined, obviously, in the sharpest possible terms, the fact that there's a danger of self-incrimination and indeed of incriminating third parties. There could, in extremis, be linked threats or intimidation. When you're working with victims and survivors, there's always the kind of concern around re-traumatization, and there's a need for huge kind of specialized training and sensitivity around that. There's also a lot of focus now on the emotional labor for us as interviewers and how working on these sensitive and difficult subjects and indeed for those who work tirelessly to offer support to victims and survivors, the emotional toll and the human toll that all of that takes on them. I suppose sometimes people will say to me, look, you know, what right does an oral historian have to come in and unsettle community or family or workplace relations? Some people may think they're getting by all right with their own carefully calibrated way of kind of knowing what to talk about and what not to talk about. And there certainly, I suppose, should be no way in which we would wish to impose oral history on a community. And so it's about a voluntary process, and it's also then about timing, because even within families, you will get a variety of different perspectives in terms of when people are ready and when people want to prioritize different approaches, whether that's seeking an apology, whether it's giving an interview, or whether it's pushing for some other form of truth and justice. There's possibilities around interview fatigue. Some people here have been interviewed to death, and that can bleed into what I've also described maybe as narrative traps, where there's sometimes a nervousness that some stories or perspectives have been overheard and others have been ignored. And indeed, as we know in oral history, that can ultimately generate certain tropes that need to be challenged. But I suppose cutting through all of that, I would highlight a couple of kind of overarching points that have come into kind of sharp relief in light of these recent government proposals that have been put forward in recent months. And it speaks to the need, I suppose, for in order to realise the benefits that I spoke to on the last slide, it's obviously key that we have trust. And I suppose here, one of the things, I've just written a piece about this recently for the Journal of Law and Society, looking at the oral history and social legal studies. But I was looking at this issue of like archives and archivists not necessarily being neutral. And that was very much, I suppose, brought to my mind when I was critiquing the proposed role of the Public Records Office as the place where an oral history archive of the Troubles would be parked. And it also comes into play when we all have to say to people, don't just trust this friendly face in front of you. I would absolutely say that it is important that people trust and feel comfortable and should be facilitated in doing interviews with someone that they know and trust, whether that is someone who works with or gets the RUC and somebody maybe wants to speak to a known and trusted member of that community to give their story. But there is a point, if we're going to filter these stories through into a central archive, where people need to be aware that the trust doesn't stop with this face in front of you, but they need to think through, I suppose, all of the different phases of data handling and be able to trust at each and every stage. I mentioned then these recent proposals, and I'll come back to this issue of a danger that I see that has come up in recent times, whereby you could see a situation where oral history is sort of co-opted or privileged as an alternative to truth, justice, and accountability. And I think that that could do untold damage to the credibility of the field, and indeed would certainly dilute the benefits that I alluded to a few minutes ago. But I'll come back to that in this slide, actually. I thought it was the next one, but I am going to speak now a little bit more about the dangers of co-option, because I've mentioned a couple of times there that moving on from that slide where I brought things up to the Stormont House Agreement and kind of parked that there, it's important just to note for anybody that's not aware that at the start of last year, there was great hope with the institutions getting back up and running and the New Decade, New Approach Agreement. There was a promise that the legislation to implement the Stormont House Agreement would finally be introduced within 100 days. So there was a real sense of hope at that point that we were finally going to see progress. And then, I suppose, quite suddenly and certainly shockingly to me, in March and then again in July, we had the announcement by the government that actually they were minded to move away from the Stormont House Agreement. This was a unilateral move. It was not done in consultation or in any agreement with the Irish government, who is the signatory to the treaty that would underpin the ICIR and had obviously been party to the agreement signed at Stormont House. And it didn't just move away from the Stormont House Agreement, it also proposed a sweeping amnesty, ostensibly to focus on truth recovery and reconciliation. And that sweeping amnesty would signal an immediate halt to all criminal investigations into Troubles-related offences. It would close down with immediate effect the inquests that we have families that have been waiting decades for their inquest to finally be heard, shut down, and civil actions as well. And I'm not going to go into the details of the nature of the amnesty here, but my colleague Louise Mallender is the expert in that area, and she did quite a forensic examination of comparable post-conflict amnesties in the post-Second World War period, and concluded that what was being proposed was worse than that put forward by Augusto Pinochet. So that's now often referred to as kind of Pinochet plus. But to compensate for all of that, we're being offered a truth recovery body devoid of police power, so relying in the main part on voluntary disclosure. An NIO-sponsored official history of the Troubles has now been mooted in the last few weeks. And interestingly, oral history and memorialization initiatives, if anything, have come front and center. So there was always a recognition that people valued the role of oral history, and you saw that with the Oral History Archive proposed under the Stormont House Agreement. But I think it's interesting that the NIO legacy lead, Chris Flatt, when speaking before the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee a few weeks ago, interestingly said that he thought that oral history memorialization initiatives were arguably the most important component of the new package. And I suppose you could say, well, isn't that manna from heaven for someone like you who's been practically evangelical about the benefits of oral history in this landscape for years? But I immediately, I suppose, saw a cause for grave concern, not least because this was happening in the context of what I've just described in terms of a sweeping amnesty, but also because of the widespread opposition from victims groups, from political parties, from the Irish government, from the UN, the Council of Europe, the Committee of Ministers, and so forth. And I saw a real danger that oral history could perhaps be used as something of a smokescreen, a kind of a consolation prize for closing down that which has invited the type of opposition that I've listed there. So I suppose to kind of shift back now to a slightly more positive vein, because throughout this process, our model build team has always said that we're not just in the business of kind of criticizing, that we've always tried to come up with workable solutions and workarounds. And I suppose in that vein, I had begun to think about how you might go about managing and delivering a comprehensive oral history programme in a situation where you didn't have that egregious amnesty that I've just described. And I suppose if there was anything gratifying at all in the government's new proposals, it was a recognition that there was a need to move beyond that quite top-down state-centric model that was proposed at Stormont House initially by the government, which proposed folding the Oral History Archive into the Public Records Office of Northern Ireland. There's now certainly a recognition in the new proposals that we need a much more fluid and flexible mechanism that will enable the engagement with existing groups, both those that are holding on to oral history material and those that could be engaged to collect material at community level. And this was something that we had been talking about certainly from our first critiques of the PRONI model, so it was gratifying to see that coming through. We've also been talking about the need for independent and transparent oversight. And so here, I suppose, what I felt was necessary really was an honest broker, as I've described it. And I have posited the notion of engaging the Arts and Humanities Research Council. They have, as many of you will know, a long experience of working through the Communities Connect programme and so on, working with and through a diverse range of academics and community groups, according to thematic calls, you know, and most importantly, in accordance with clear and transparent criteria. And although at source funded by government, they're entirely independent. And I felt that they could perhaps be engaged to help try and broker a kind of a programme for this diverse and complex work in the broader oral history and memorialisation sphere. And I've talked about phasing that, partly to address this issue of needing to build up trust. The first phase, as I see it, would need to focus on preservation, because there's an awful lot of really valuable work that has already been done. Maybe work that was funded under Piece 3, work that has been done, you know, in the course of various different projects that have got in touch with me over the years and said, what can I do with my material? I don't want to give it to this archive. I don't want to give it to that archive. And so those of you that have had cause to go back and renegotiate access to interviews that were conducted in the past, I could almost see you nodding your head when I say you couldn't begin to imagine the time and energy and resources necessary to engage in that work. But I would put funding first and foremost into the time that it takes to shoring up and safeguarding existing materials and doing with it that which is necessary to enable it to be shared. I would then train up people, including seasoned oral historians who are already doing fantastic work and people new to it who would be versed in the standards necessary to enable material to be shared with the Central Archive. And then I would try and capture unheard voices and would do it, I think, thematically. So speaking to gender, urban, rural, you could imagine different themes on the back of an audit of what has already been done. You could imagine structuring that. And then you could invite different archives, different museums, different oral history groups to put together proposals for ways in which a central archive, and that might be a shared or a composite body, you could look at different ways of doing it, but essentially to give kind of shape to a way of drawing that material together. I wouldn't make sharing the material contingent on funding in the first phases, but I think the carrot, if you like, would be that in order to contribute to work on broader patterns and themes, people would be encouraged to share the stories of their community with a central archive, so that it could feed through into the work on broader patterns and themes. And as I say, that's deliberately phased to allow trust to develop, but all of it with the firm caveat that I'm wary of developing kind of work in this area too much, because I feel at the minute the core message really needs to focus on the fact that, as the Special Rapporteur on Transitional Justice said, any kind of memory mechanism can never serve as a pretext for de jure or de facto impunity for gross violations of human rights. And in my view, any improvements in our approach to oral history will only actually become relevant in a context wherein you do have Article 2 compliant truth recovery through appropriately empowered institutions. And as I say, any attempt to promote oral history, I feel, whilst simultaneously closing down effective routes to truth and accountability, won't work, could be seen as a cover for impunity, and could actually do untold damage to the credibility of the field and its capacity to help deal with these vexed issues. So in terms of then oral history and truth recovery, I think it's really important to acknowledge that truth is a very complex and a contested term, as all of you working in the field of oral history know all too well. It's also important perhaps to note that whilst there's been some legal wrangling about whether or not there's a right to truth, Amnesty International would hold firmly, and others, of course, that there is, as a way of avoiding impunity and adhering to victims' rights. But it should be said there's no legal wrangling about the right to an independent and thorough investigation. That's just hard law. But going back to the complexities, it's worth noting that in the South African TRC, which is so often referred to, they talked about at least 3 different types of truth. I folded 3 and 4 together because I think they're effectively pointing at the same thing. So there's factual or forensic truth, that which can be corroborated and kind of based on verifiable evidence. There is, as we all know in the field of oral history, there's personal or narrative truth, there's subjective truth, and that has been amongst the richest vein of oral history work that we've seen in recent decades, is unpacking those silences and myths and all of the subjectivities that can be packed into rich oral narratives. And all of that can kind of feed through together into work on broader social truth, providing opportunities, as we've been talking about, to hear one another, to hear other perspectives, to challenge myths that come to light, and all of that to kind of broaden perspectives in a way that could help to facilitate not a cozy reconciliation, but the hard work of dealing with difficult truths and coming to terms with the reality and the complexity of the past. In the South African TRC, it's worth noting that you really had a broadly legalistic approach juxtaposed with the narrative and subjective aspects of truth recovery. And at different stages, one was preferred over the other. So you had a narrative approach, as Wilson noted, dominant during televised hearings, and then a legalistic or more forensic version significant in later stages when the report was being written up. This is my last slide, I should reassure you, because I'm not sure, but I feel I've been talking now for probably the best part of the 40 minutes allotted to me. But in this last slide, I just want to try and kind of bring this full circle a little bit if I can, thinking again about the place and role of oral history alongside truth, justice and accountability in light of the context that I've just shaded in for you. And I suppose the first thing that I would say is that I was glad to see the UN come out and say that sometimes oral history was seen in transitional justice as just this soothing add-on, something nice to kind of add on at when the serious business of cranking cases through the courts or dealing with reparations or, you know, dealing with more legalistic mechanisms was finished. And it was interesting and I think reassuring to me to hear the UN Special Rapporteur say that far from being a soothing add-on, that actually he sees work on broader memorialization and oral history included within that is actually vital to upholding international law, the standards, international human rights standards. And he describes it therefore as the fifth pillar of transitional justice. And I suppose the point is that carefully designed oral history projects can help to build democratic cultures in which human rights are respected. They can certainly link through to and inform the right to truth, reparations and acknowledgement. And we've seen this coming through in the work in the mother and babies homes, the different ways in which oral history could be a form of reparation, but it can also inform truth recovery as well. It can confront toxic cultures of violence and marginalization, and it can dovetail with effective information recovery, as we saw, for example, in the Canadian TRC on the legacy of Indian residential schools, or as I've mentioned in the work in mother and babies homes. You can see different ways in which it could potentially dovetail with other mechanisms. And all of that, as I've said, could inform broader patterns and themes of conflict. That would also link through to another goal of transitional justice around non-recurrence, because we need to understand how we got there in the first place in order to be able to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. But the point that I hope I have made loud and clear is that none of this is an alternative to full and proper investigations, in my view. Rather, oral history with teeth, if you like, is a vitally important complement to them. And I suppose just to come back to that well-thumbed text that probably most of us started out with, the Thompson's Voice of the Past. It was certainly the book that when I was starting out my PhD, it was actually my last year at Trinity as an undergraduate, when I hit on that book and really got interested in what how oral history could inform and indeed change history. And thinking back to that, which really initially inspired me, I was struck by the fact that this can and should be a history built around people, the ways in which oral history brings history into and out of communities. And as Thompson was not pulling any punches in saying, it can be a means for transforming both the content and purpose of history. And that, I think, has been evident in sinister ways in recent years, or in recent months, really, in terms of, and encourages us to need to be vigilant. And indeed to revisit what I think is that resistant thrust of oral history from below. It's more necessary than ever, in my view, as a challenge to hegemonic and official narratives. So I'm not going to say any more than that. I hope I didn't run over time too much. But that's really just a race through some of the work that I've been involved in recent years, in kind of looking at oral history as one possible way of helping to deal with the past and in meeting the challenges that have been thrown down as part of that work. So thank you very much for listening, and I will stop sharing my screen now so that we can hopefully take questions.
Thank you so much, Anna. We really appreciate that. Thank you for guiding us through such the complex journey of oral history in the context of Northern Ireland and the delicate balance that has to be struck. And I'm sure there are lots of questions. Please put your questions into the chat, and Arlene is going to moderate the question session here. And I will hand it over to your questions, and I'm sure there will be many.